We're gonna have to do a little, it's still setting it up. So we're gonna have to do a little test because sometimes it starts, there's some like echoing that happens.
So this meeting is now streaming live on YouTube. Hi guys, hey world.
So I think hopefully this doesn't make the whole meeting muted. But I have to mute YouTube because otherwise there's an echo.
Uh-huh.
So hello world. This is Door 3 TV live on YouTube.
Who brought the snacks?
This is technically our third episode of Open Hours, but really it's episode 1. Are we calling this episode 1?
I thought the last one was episode 1, Liz.
Okay, this is episode 2.
I'd like to say that comic books do this all the time. They're like, this is issue number 1, and they keep reissuing in issue number 1 every time they want to make a splash.
Archivists in the future will struggle to figure out what the actual canon of Door 3 TV is.
I feel for the.
Yeah, I pity them. I do too. No, they're going to have their work cut out for them, Liz. I think you, as the owner of this, as the author, should say decisively what number this is. It will help them.
We'll give this a firm 1.5.
Okay.
I'm Liz Flintz. I'm the director of UX and design here at Door 3, and we have Alex Asanov, president and founder of Door 3, and Jonathan Blessing, CEO of Door 3 here. Hey, what is Door 3? Who wants to say what Door 3 is?
Alex, I feel like whenever that question's asked, it goes to you, man, because it's your baby.
Okay,
brought it
all right.
into the world.
You're right.
You leave me alone to babysit it.
And rear and raise it a bit too. So you have more to do with it than you want to claim.
Care and feeding.
So Door 3 is a digital consulting firm. What does that mean? So it's a bunch of words that aren't often seen together. We take into account user experience design and experience in general, even outside the little square rectangle of a monitor, technology and strategy. And we do everything from just building a solution for a particular problem to rethinking an organization's business with a technology, with an injection of technology wisdom and kind of future, looking forward into the future and planning for that. So digital transformation, all the way down to tactical implementation of systems. And we deal with systems that are very complex at times. And we generally do that in a de-risked manner. We're known for delivering really complex systems very reliably.
So thanks, Alex. This week, our topic is the dangers of code first. A few weeks ago, we talked about slow to code, and now we're going to talk about code first. Basically, I don't know anything about
Liz,
this.
Liz, again, just to help the archivists, the slow to code discussion we had, that was a prototype demo meeting, which I would love to revisit that topic and publish that online. That's something I'd love to revisit.
Oh, we will.
Okay. So again, you have to speak about it happening in the future, because for the people watching this,
we'll talk about slow to code again.
Okay.
But now we're talking about code first. I mean, maybe that makes sense to talk about code first.
I just worry about the future.
Yeah.
I think the archivists will have a great deal of fun, like in those treasure hunting novels. That's the globe hopping, like where is that crazy guy in the painting, kind of movie or book. That's going to be people researching Door 3.
All right, you just compared Door 3 to Waldo.
Or Devils and Demons, or whatever that those crazy books are about. Anyway, let's move on.
You gotta get this on rails.
So yeah, code first is one of those things that sounds very simple. I attempted to look up some reference to this concept in advance of this recording, and it's one of those things that I looked up and then I was more confused after I'd read some blog posts that had a lot of like diagrammatic instructions on them than I was before I had ever heard the term. So my first question is, what is code first? Can someone explain this to me, please?
Sure. Jonathan, do you want to take it or?
No, I'm going to let you stick your neck out first.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and then I'll weigh in.
That's what I do.
Yeah,
That's
but
what a smart
remember,
CEO will do.
This is the pre-judge. This is where we describe our view of it without judgment.
Yeah. So
judgment comes later.
Sure. So code in the old world, right? When you built an application, especially a business application, you would consider the structure of the data, right? You'd build your database, and then you would, often different people with different skills would build the code that then reads and writes to the, right? And so you have these two worlds that make up an application: the application code and the database and the database code, the database structure and database code. Those two worlds were maintained. They had to be maintained together, but separately. And frameworks arose that allow developers to access the database without knowing a lot about the database from the code. And those frameworks evolved further so that you could translate the code, the needs of the code, into the structure of the database. And that idea did away for the people who use this with needing to take care of the database separately. You kind of take care of the database by taking care of the code, right? And that's a very enticing idea, right? Because now you have only one world to curate instead of two. So that is in a nutshell, the nature of the transition. And code first was the methodology that took advantage of this technical evolution and said, just start coding, right? Build your objects, and the database repositories that hold those objects, persist those objects, will magically come into existence.
Okay, so yes, that's what it is, but we're missing a little bit more of the background, I think. So in olden times, back when computers were powered by steam engines, there were, broadly speaking, two different ways of conceptualizing the environments that we were trying to formalize with software. There was the relational model, which was a framework for describing a domain, and then there was the object model, or object-oriented design. So we have the relational, we have the object models, and these two models were different. They had different. They had different. They were. It's almost like the way in which people. When you move between two different natural languages, you inherit and you give up different strengths of characterization. And that's true of these two different ways of viewing the world. So in olden times, the relational model was the way in which we would try to define data at rest. So because the relational model would often be found in the database system where the information would persist. And the object model would be the landscape on which we would be defining a business process or business processes, because that would be the application level. And what's interesting is these two models have different strengths and different weaknesses when it comes to conceptualizing any given domain. And when we were building, think of client server stuff, when we were building applications that would necessarily inhabit both of these different models or landscapes for modeling, they would almost always be about the same thing. And this would give rise to what computer scientists call impedance mismatch, which creates trouble. It creates trouble. It's because it's an opportunity for you to talk about the same thing two different ways. So it creates trouble both in coming to have a definitive agreement for how you would define something, like just think of like an inventory management system. And so, and of course, we'd iron out this disagreement, and the system would get built. But then that potential for disagreement would arise every time there's a need or some sort of reason to evolve or modify the system at large. And so code first, I'm sorry, this is all like a preamble, but so what's code first? Code first is a sledgehammer in many ways that makes these different modeling domains opaque to the software developer. So instead of trying to live in two, he only has to live in one. And that's the object modeling environment. So when you're embarking on a software project and your tool is some sort of code first framework, really what we're saying is that you're going to define the business environment using a single modeling language or a single modeling framework, and that would be an object one. And the code first platform or tool set that you're using will do its very best to translate your modeling commitments into the relational space if you're using a relational database. But often we're not using relational databases anymore, but that's
so the assumption is that these data exist somewhere and you just have to go find them?
I don't understand that, Liz. Sorry.
So the assumption is that the objects which refer to these data sets that we're not worrying about, that eventually there's some eventually they must come into play, right?
I think so, Alex, and I think let me take one more swipe at this.
Yeah.
By offering up a concrete example. So let's say that a publisher comes to us. It's like a publisher, like Random House or something, comes to us and says, we need a new system for tracking our books and our authors. Well, in olden times, we'd get the business analysts on the project, and we would create a canonical information model of their books and authors, right? And then we would turn this canonical model over to a database architect and to an application architect. And they would then each recapitulate that canonical model in terms that could be used for building a database and in terms that could be used for building the application layer.
Mm-hmm.
So inherently, they're talking about the same things, right? Books and authors, but they're talking about them differently. So one is, in .NET and the other is in, say, SQL. And code first basically says the BA still goes in, he develops the canonical model, but we don't have one architect. We don't have two architects on the job anymore. We've got one architect, and that one architect is going to recapitulate that model in an object environment. And then some code first framework will then attempt, and often quite successfully now in 2021, to recapitulate that object model in a language that the persistent data store, often a relational database or an object database, understands.
So I agree with everything you just said, Jonathan, but that literally is the perfect segue for the very first hazard, the most critical hazard that I believe exists in thinking of application development through a code first approach, right? And the hazard lies in forgetting the first thing that used to happen, which is a domain analysis, right? The expertise required of an analyst to do the analysis, right? Because what happens is code first frameworks are often used in smaller projects, right? And sometimes they're extended, their utilization is extended to larger projects, and that's hazardous. But what happens is on smaller projects, a lot of times the business owner, product owner is kind of saying, well, it's not a very, put a developer on it, and the developer says, oh, I'm going to do this code first. I'm just going to build the objects that represent the what the application needs to, forgetting the fact that an application is really a model of the real world, and that that translation from the real world to the digital world is best done by someone who's very skilled at it, not a developer or an architect who's at instantiating a model in the digital space. The architects live more in the digital space. You need someone who is used to living at the divide and actually maybe a little bit more in the real world and modeling that world and bringing that model to
Alex,
developers.
I think I actually have a lovely way to describe this hazard that you've identified, which I fully buy, right? And that's, you know, when we think code first, I think the hazard is that we're coding first, that we're jumping over or we're somehow circumventing the role that the information analyst or BA used to play back when he knew that he would have to answer to two different people, a database architect and an application architect. And so now I think the real hazard that we should be kind of wary of is just circumventing this entirely and coding first. So Liz, when we do our slow to code episode, we can return to this theme of you know, the hazards of moving too quickly at first.
So
Yeah.
Want to hear my second? Want to hear my second hazard?
Yeah.
System performance. This is a meaty one that people can sink their teeth into. So code first, almost always, but not always, implies that there's an ORM, an object relational mapper, in the mix. And because what we get with a code first development approach is the ability for the application architect to really only have to work in one modeling framework, which would be an object one. And then everything else just happens magically. Well, that magic that's happening in the background doesn't, it means that we're relying on some forward-looking piece of software to be writing queries. And you know, and frankly, like just from in my own practice, my own experience, you know, we've gotten a lot of work, Door3, out of helping clients who had already embarked on a code first application development project, built something, had it accepted into production, and then only to see that it's just kind of ground to a halt under heavy utilization. And on inspection, what we've seen is that the SQL, especially, we see this with SQL, was written in such a suboptimal way by the code first architecture, or the ORM in particular, that we've had to go in and circumvent kind of the ORM with handwritten code. So performance, I'd say, is another hazard.
Yep. That is definitely the case. Another element of this, and this is very debatable, the next one is very debatable, is certain elements of maintainability. Because I do want to say that, you know, one of the difficulties of maintaining applications in the old world, where you did have either two, for an architect that had to manage two domains, your database and your code domains, right, is that you had to keep them in sync. Like if there was a requirement change, you needed to change your database, you needed to change your code, right? And so there's a maintainability issue with that world. There's also a bit of a maintainability issue from a kind of different angle with the code first approach, because when someone needs to make a change, they can make it fairly blindly, right? And this is gonna come right back to performance, but it is a maintainability dimension, right? So someone can make a change and they can say, oh, I'm just gonna add some more properties to this object, and it's just in the background is gonna add some fields to a database, or maybe if the properties are an array, it'll create, you know, a related table or something like that, right? Well, that additional relationship could grind that application to a halt, and you wouldn't spot that in a normal regression test, right? Because in a normal regression test, you're not loading the application. You would only spot that if you're running load testing as part of your maintenance, and almost nobody does because of the cost of that, right? And so so what happens is that people begin to rely on this. It's like GPS. You don't. I moved to a new neighborhood. Speaking of things that are maybe a little bit less geeky than all the stuff that we're talking about, I moved to a new neighborhood 6 months ago. It's only now, 6 months later, that I'm able to get to the supermarket without a GPS, right? And the reason for that is because I had a GPS, right? Like my brain was not challenged to think about where I was and which direction was north, right? And so before GPS, I would have learned my way around within a couple of days. I would have had to, right? I would have had a cross-reference into the map. My brain would map the map to the real world because the map is a model, right? And I understand that model and how it relates to the real world, and I drive the car down the road, right? The assistance that the ORM provides creates a reliance that reduces the thinking, and the reduction in thinking during maintenance leads to problems.
I want to challenge you on this.
Go ahead.
You can make this argument about anything. So really,
yes,
like what in particular about code first? What is that actually? How about this? I want you to restate this risk and explain to us what in particular about code first, yes, makes us puts us at whatever this risk is.
Eliminates the need to think about the database in any concrete terms that relate to the database's inherent performance mechanics, right? And the result of that is that when you make changes to the application, you can inadvertently make changes to the database that are counter to good performance, right? Mm-hmm. And there's nothing in your thinking as a developer who relies on the ORM to do this.
But what was our second hazard? Wasn't it performance?
Like I said, didn't I just say this is going to come right back to performance? But it is specifically a maintainability issue, right? Where there's like, let's build an application that's performant. That's number one, right? Number two is I need to maintain this application in general. Like I want to maximize the lifetime value of the application. I will reduce my cost of ownership of this application. All of these things, are dependent on a balance of human value and technology value that comes together to the monetary value of that software for the software owner. And poor maintainability, even if it results in a performance issue, which we covered under hazard 2, is a maintainability problem, ownership problem, right? It's a business value problem that is in maintenance, not in development.
I don't understand still why it's harder to maintain.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna hit him on that too.
Bad code, right? It's easier to maintain an application that is not tuned.
Jonathan?
Okay, well, here's my.
Feeling some thoughts?
I am feeling some thoughts. I'm feeling two thoughts. One, I disagree about the maintainability. I actually think that code first applications are inherently easier to maintain. Two, where I might agree with you, though this wasn't exactly a point you were making. So it's something that frustrates me about code first applications, especially at scale, especially where the application is of critical value. It's that a very significant tool is not present for the developers or the DevOps folks in terms of tuning the overall application. Because everything, for the most part, has to be done through the object model in the application. Because if you, the moment you begin unilaterally making changes at the storage level, you can break the ORM. Or you have to at least say, you know what, ORM, you no longer, like this section, this subsection of the database is no longer within your purview. So sorry, someone's at the door, live TV.
While Jonathan is not in the picture, I can say this is my opportunity to disagree with him, but I don't really disagree with him. I think, generally speaking, there is a performance risk, and that is the bigger risk. My issue about maintainability is the maintainability of the performance, not overall maintainability. I think I qualified pretty clearly that overall maintainability, there are some advantages, especially with simple to medium scale applications that code first has. So it really does come down to performance, and developers don't think a lot about the database when they're doing code first because they don't have to. And
Mhm.
I do still think that it is a hazard to lose that skill, because when you run into that performance bottleneck, you don't have people on staff who can deal with that, who can address that performance issue, and you can have that performance issue for a while plaguing you as people are trying to do things that they're not used to doing, which is tuning things at the database level through a layer that doesn't want to let you add it very easily, which is the ORM layer.
So what you're saying is it's a little sticky, like you can get stuck with one configuration and make things more difficult or
I think you can get stuck not solving a problem that you need to solve. Like when performance issues arise in production, they need to be handled fairly expeditiously. And because let's say you've reached a user adoption level where suddenly all of your users are experiencing problems, right? You can't wait on that. Like your entire user base is at risk, right? So and this is the problem. Like a lot of early stage companies, they start with what they think of as a prototype, right? And someone drops in with something like a .NET ORM framework or Ruby on Rails is a classic, right? And then they get to a point where there's nothing as permanent as temporary. So they built this proof of concept. They kind of launched it with a few people, and then it became their MVP. And now they're accruing users, and the system can't handle it. And now what?
I'm
right?
sorry, guys, but my neighbor just dropped in. I have to go. Live TV.
Okay. So my opinion is going to win out. So, although Jonathan and I are not in violent disagreement, I think, look, ORM has its and the code first has its uses. This is not a let's beat code first to death, video cast, right? While there are hazards, climbing Mount Everest can be hazardous, and people still do it because it's worth it, right? So there are times to do things using a code first approach. Prototypes, great use case for that. Small applications where the resulting underlying database model is kind of small and not very complicated. Great use of that. Administration tools can be a good use for use case for code first. When you get into big complicated applications, that's where the hazards may outweigh the benefits. There are benefits to code first, right? Maintainability and just the ability to spin up a database without having a database expert sitting right next to you is fantastic, right?
In another show, we should talk about I'm very curious where you draw the lines between small, medium, and large scale applications. These are terms that we keep referring to, and I think they mean something quite specific to you. And I think that it would be interesting for others to kind of hear where the demarcations are between.
Let's do that one at, let's say, 11 o'clock at night at some point, because I want to make sure that, like, when I talk about really like things that put people to sleep, I do it at the time when they're ready to go to sleep, right? Because there's a lot of the question of like what's a big application, what's a medium application. There's so much nuance into it. I remember when Obama was president, you'd ask him like, do you like Coca-Cola, and he'd give you a 20-minute answer. Like this has that much nuance to it, right? Because it's not just.
I think if you just like talk about money, if you just throw the money question in there, it gets a lot more interesting. But we're at about time, Alex, and unfortunately we can't say goodbye with Jonathan here too. But this has been episode 1.5 of Open Hours, Door 3 TV.
Thank you all for joining.
Yeah, and how should people get in touch with us?
You can email us at projects@door3.com. And that's, or you can go to our website and just submit a little form that says, hey, get in touch with me. I want to talk to you. Honestly, you don't have to have a project that you want to talk about. Like if there's just something about this podcast that piqued your interest, that you want to talk about and debate a little bit, we're happy to take a few calls like that. So
We're chatty people.
Yeah.
as a rule.
Otherwise, leave your comments down below.
Yeah,
And don't forget to hit that like button.
smash that like button.
Smash that like button. Yeah, that's what you're supposed to say these days. I don't know. When did YouTube get so violent? How about gently, press that
Oh,
like button?
here's Jonathan again. We can say goodbye with him too. Hey, we just did our outro, but you're back now.
Is he?
Yeah.
I thought he was back, but I don't see him. I see you and I see,
Oh.
your
Well,
background.
oh, here he is. Okay, we're signing off. Bye, everybody.
Bye.